It's shortly before noon, and a Westfield, Massachusetts police detective is walking out of the building he's worked in for over 2 decades. He doesn't say where he's going. He doesn't have to. It's lunch. Within the hour, his wife, of 33 years, will be dead on their dining room floor. Minutes later, he will call 911. His voice will be calm. He will tell the dispatcher that she shot herself. For more than a year, almost everyone who loved her will believe him. There will be a gun, his gun. There will be a wound. There will be a story. What there will not be, not at first, is anyone asking the one question that should have come before all the others. What was a Westfield police detective searching for 11 days before his wife died on a computer no one ever checked? That search is still sitting there, waiting.
Welcome to the darkest corners. Subscribe and turn on notifications.
Amy Hansen was 16 years old when she met Brian Fanion at Westfield High School. He was 19. It was 1983, the kind of small-town meeting that, in hindsight, people like to call fate. 2 years later, they were married. Brian had followed in his family's footsteps and was climbing the ladder at the Westfield Police Department, while Amy became a stay-at-home mother as they started their family, first Travis, then their daughter, Tori. In 2000, they bought a farmhouse on Montgomery Road, a property built in the 1800s, big enough to fill with 2 growing kids, a garden, and a life that, from the outside, looked complete. Amy was, by every account, left behind by the people who knew her, a kind and selfless woman, a lover of nature, gardening, hiking, kayaking, and bicycling. She gave her time to Wyben Union Church, where Brian served as a deacon. She volunteered for years at the Cancer House of Hope, where the people she sat with remembered her as compassionate and reliable, the kind of presence that made hard days a little easier. She was, in the words of one friend who watched her walk home from church with Brian, simply someone whose warmth made you smile. You picture her in that farmhouse kitchen, 33 years into a marriage, a garden out back she'd tended for nearly 2 decades, 2 grown children who'd turned out, by all appearances, just fine. Retirement was close. Brian was approaching the end of his career at the department. They were supposed to be entering the easy part. On the morning of May 8, 2018, Amy Fanion went about an ordinary Tuesday. There was no goodbye that anyone remembers as unusual, no last photograph anyone has pointed to, just a woman in her own home on a day that looked exactly like the one before it. She had no idea it would be her last.
Shortly after noon on May 8, 2018, Brian Fanion called 911 to report that his wife had shot herself in the head. Patrol units and an ambulance arrived at the farmhouse on Montgomery Road. Inside the dining room, they found Amy. The weapon beside her wasn't a household gun bought for protection. It was Brian's department-issued service pistol. At first, the scene told a simple story: a wife, a gunshot wound to the head, a husband's account of finding her that way. Amy's death was initially ruled a suicide. There's one detail from the scene that didn't get attention until much later, and it's worth sitting with now. When Brian was found with Amy, he was holding her hand. Investigators would eventually test that hand and his for gunshot residue. Both came back positive, though a positive result on his hand could just as easily be explained by that single act of holding hers. It's the kind of detail that cuts 2 ways, and at the time, almost no one thought to ask which way it cut. The toxicology report on Amy came back clean. No substances were found in her system, no medication, nothing that might explain a sudden, unexplainable act of self-harm. For a department that prided itself on procedure, that should have been the first quiet flag. It wasn't, not yet. Brian Fanion was one of their own, a detective, a deacon, a man married to the same woman for 33 years in a town where everybody knew somebody who knew them. Westfield is not a big city. It is the kind of place where a man's reputation walks into the room before he does. So when Brian said his wife took her own life, people believed him, because believing the alternative meant believing that a man they trusted with their town's investigations had just become the subject of one. Amy's family gathered in shock and grief. Word moved through the church, through the cancer house of hope, through a community that had watched the Fanions raise 2 children and grow old together. There was no widening search for her. There was no missing persons report, no frantic phone calls going unanswered. Amy wasn't missing. She was gone, and for a year and a half, almost everyone who loved her accepted the reason they'd been given. But somewhere in the department, a different kind of silence was building. The kind that comes from a homicide detective's death scene doesn't quite close the way it's supposed to.
Massachusetts State Police homicide investigators don't take a fellow officer's word at face value, not when the dead woman is his wife and the gun is his. They started where they always start: the scene, the timeline, the people closest to Amy. The case quietly moved from death investigation to something with sharper edges. Investigators pulled Brian's work computer. What they found wasn't immediately damning until they lined it up against the calendar. 11 days before Amy died, on April 27, 2018, Brian Fanion searched GSR testing on his work computer. Between 9:22 and 9:38 that morning, he visited 5 different web pages about gunshot residue. Among them, an article titled "Gunshot Residue Collection: The Decisions That Make or Break a Case," and a YouTube news segment called "What Gunshot Residue Tests Tell Us." On its face, that's not strange. He's a detective. Except, as prosecutors would later establish, gunshot residue testing had nothing to do with his actual work at the Westfield Police Department. He wasn't assigned to any active investigation that spring that would have required it, and nobody at the department even handled GSR testing. Investigators kept going. The day before Amy died, on May 7th, Brian repeatedly searched how to remove frequent contacts from his phone. A small thing, the kind of search a man makes when he's hiding a number he doesn't want found, or, as his defense would later insist, the kind of search a man makes when he's simply switching phones. 2 explanations, 2 very different men. Then came the people. According to trial testimony, Amy's sister, Anna Hansen, said that sometime after Amy's death, Brian confided in her that he was anxious about a search he'd made online, one she said he described as how to make a murder look like a suicide. It's the kind of statement, if true, ends the case before it starts. But another witness disputed it. A detective on the case, under cross-examination, testified he never actually found a search matching that description on any device. So which is it? A confession that slipped out in a moment of fear, or a memory reshaped by grief and time? Investigators didn't have the luxury of choosing. They had to chase both. And then there was the marriage itself. Brian wasn't just a husband approaching retirement. He stood to give up roughly half his pension in a divorce. Investigators found searches on his work computer about exactly that. What happens to a police pension when a marriage ends? A man unwilling to lose half of what he'd spent a career building. A man who'd researched how gunshot residue works less than 2 weeks before his wife died from a gunshot wound. A man who'd scrubbed his phone the day before. Detectives now had motive on the table. What they didn't yet have was a name for what or who that motive was actually for. Here's the detail that changed everything. Investigators eventually found their way to a woman named Corinne Hasty, known as Corey.
According to the case prosecutors built, Brian had met her years earlier on a church missionary trip to Mexico, the same church where he served as a deacon, the same faith his wife had built her life around. Their relationship became, in the state's account, Brian Fanion's primary motive for murder. Suddenly, the phone search from May 7th wasn't about a new device. Prosecutors argued Brian wasn't trying to erase all the data off his phone. He was specifically searching how to delete his frequently contacted list, because he didn't want state police finding evidence of his relationship with Corey. And suddenly, the gunshot residue research from 11 days earlier wasn't idle curiosity from a bored detective. It was a man preparing for what would come after. Think back. Earlier, the deacon at the lectern, the 33-year marriage everyone in Westfield admired. Now hold that image next to a man who, according to the state, had already chosen someone else and simply couldn't see a path out that didn't cost him his reputation, his church standing, and half his pension. As prosecutors would later frame it, he was ready to start a new chapter of his life that didn't include Amy. He'd chosen his partner. Amy was the only thing standing in the way. And in his mind, divorce was public, but murder didn't have to be. This is the moment investigators stopped looking at Amy's death as a tragedy and started looking at it as a crime scene staged by someone who knew exactly how crime scenes get read. New warrants followed, a closer look at the timeline of that morning, a harder look at a detective who, prosecutors would argue, left work shortly before Amy's death, and that the timing fit a planned killing, not a sudden tragedy. It would take until November 6, 2019, a year and a half after Amy died, for that theory to become an arrest. Brian Fanion, the man half the town still believed he had lost his wife to a sudden, unexplainable act of despair, was indicted for her murder. The trial opened on February 21, 2023, in Hampden Superior Court, what local reporters would call Westfield's most publicized case in memory. Assistant District Attorney Mary Sandstrom laid out the state's case plainly. A man trapped in a marriage he couldn't walk away from without losing everything he'd built, who chose a quieter, deadlier exit instead. Defense attorney Jeffrey Brown offered a different story entirely. He told the jury Amy had struggled with anger and anxiety, and that an argument that morning over Brian's retirement plans and his refusal to attend a family member's play had pushed her to a breaking point no one could have predicted. And here is the part of this case that almost never happens. After Amy's death, many members of her own family signed a letter in support of Brian, certain she had taken her own life. Several of them were called to testify for the prosecution, and instead, their testimony supported the defense. Only one family member stood apart. Anna Hansen, Amy's younger sister, was the only signer of that letter willing to testify against her brother-in-law. On the stand, she told the jury that Brian had once confided he was worried about a search he'd made, how to make a murder look like a suicide. The defense pushed back hard. They called Corey Hasty herself, and under cross-examination, she conceded something that should have helped Brian's case. When she ended their relationship, he hadn't fought to stop her. He'd simply said, "Okay." Not the reaction, the defense argued, of a man who'd just committed murder to be with her. But it was the digital trail that the jury couldn't unsee. In her closing argument, Sandstrom told the jury that on the morning of May 8th, Brian wasn't researching what would happen after a crime that occurred to him in the moment. He was researching the official units that respond after a murder. According to prosecutors, Brian had left work shortly before Amy's death, and the state argued the timing fit a planned killing, not a spontaneous one. After 12 days of testimony and 27 witnesses for the prosecution, the case went to the jury. They deliberated through one full day and into a second. Then, on March 22, 2023, the jury returned. Guilty. Murder in the first degree. Brian Fanion was sentenced that same day to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hampden District Attorney Anthony Gallooni called Fanion's conduct calculating and cruel and thanked the jury for seeing through a defense built on the idea that a respected detective and church deacon could never be capable of what the evidence showed. Defense attorney Jeffrey Brown disagreed with the verdict to the very end, telling reporters outside the courtroom that anyone who truly knew Brian and Amy knew he hadn't pulled the trigger. The jury didn't see it that way.
Brian Fanion is serving his life sentence without parole. The case has since been examined nationally, featured on CBS's 48 Hours and A&E's Killer Cases, true crime properties that, like this one, were drawn to the same uncomfortable question. How does a community keep believing a man's story for a year and a half simply because of who he was before any of this happened? Travis and Tori Fanion, Amy and Brian's 2 children, have continued to stand by their father, maintaining their belief that their mother's death was not murder. It is, perhaps, the most painful, unresolved piece of this entire case, a family permanently divided not just by grief, but by which version of that May morning they've each chosen to carry. Amy Fanion's name in most retellings of this case comes second, attached to her husband's, defined by how she died. But for over 30 years before that Tuesday in May, she was the woman who showed up at the Cancer House of Hope and made hard days easier for strangers. She was the one tending a garden on a farmhouse property she'd helped choose nearly 2 decades earlier. She was 16 years old once, falling for a boy at Westfield High School, with absolutely no way of knowing where that would lead. She deserves to be remembered as someone who built a life, not just as the woman's death finally got investigated correctly.